Richard Hale stood in front of 500 guests, cameras flashing, champagne flowing, and clasped a $2 million diamond necklace around another woman's neck while his wife watched from across the room. He smiled for the cameras. He laughed with the crowd. He called Evelyn the supportive wife behind the scenes, and the whole room applauded. What Richard didn't know was that those diamonds had been paid for with money that legally belonged to Evelyn. And that was the last mistake he would ever make. If this story speaks to you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The night Richard Hale humiliated his wife in front of 500 people, he was wearing a custom Navy suit that cost more than most Americans earn in a year. His cufflinks were monogrammed, his shoes were Italian, his smile was the kind that photographers chased and shareholders trusted, the kind that made people feel like they were standing next to greatness just by being in the same room. Evelyn Carter Hale had chosen her dress carefully that evening. A deep burgundy gown, understated, elegant, the kind of dress a woman wears when she wants to be present without being noticed. She had been doing that for 15 years, being present without being noticed. She had learned somewhere along the way that the quietest people in a room were often the most dangerous. She had simply never needed anyone to know it. The event was called the Hale Global Expansion Gala. Richard's public relations team had orchestrated every detail the venue on the 54th floor of the Meridian Investment Tower in Midtown Manhattan, the guest list that read like a who's who of American finance and politics, the centerpiece announcement that Hale Global Industries was about to execute the largest acquisition deal in its 20-year history, a $7 billion expansion into European infrastructure, the kind of deal that got a man on the cover of Fortune magazine, the kind of deal that made careers ended careers and changed the shape of industries. Evelyn had built the financial model for that deal herself, 18 months of work. She had designed the acquisition structure, the debt instruments, the risk mitigation framework, the revenue projection models that the banks had signed off on. She had done it from a private office on the 31st floor, working with a team of 3 analysts she had hired herself, communicating with board members and legal advisors under the quiet authority of her position as a silent partner and trust officer of the Carter Family Holdings, the financial entity that had seeded Hale Global with its first $40 million 16 years ago. Richard had presented the deal to the board as his own vision. Evelyn had let him. That was the kind of woman she was. Or rather, that was the kind of woman she had trained herself to become over 15 years of a marriage that had slowly, quietly, methodically taught her that her husband needed to be the star of every story, even the ones she had written herself. She was standing near the east-facing windows when it happened. The room had been buzzing for an hour, the usual cocktail circuit of hedge fund managers comparing returns, senators shaking hands with developers. Vanessa Blake moving through the crowd in a red dress that seemed designed specifically to make sure no one could look away from her. Evelyn had noticed Vanessa the moment she walked in. She had been noticing Vanessa at Richard's events for almost 2 years now. She wasn't naive. She had simply chosen very deliberately to focus on the work rather than the wound. But then Richard tapped his champagne glass. The room quieted. He was standing at the center of the main floor, Vanessa beside him, the two of them arranged like something out of a lifestyle magazine spread. Richard's smile was wide and practiced. His posture was the posture of a man who had never in his life doubted that every room belonged to him. "I want to take a moment," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room without a microphone, because Richard Hale had that kind of voice, the kind that filled spaces to acknowledge someone very special to me. Evelyn felt something shift in the air around her. She watched him reach into his jacket pocket. She watched him produce a velvet box. She watched him open it, and the room inhaled collectively at the sight of the necklace, a cascading arrangement of flawless diamonds that caught the light from every direction and sent it scattering across the ceiling like broken stars. "Vanessa," Richard said, and his voice was warm, intimate, completely unbothered by the 500 witnesses surrounding him. "You have been my inspiration, my partner, and my light." Evelyn did not move. She did not speak. She stood at the window and watched her husband clasp a $2 million diamond necklace around another woman's neck in front of every important person in their professional world. The room erupted in applause. Some people laughed, the bright, performative laughter of people who aren't sure what they're witnessing, but feel the social pressure to respond positively. Cameras flashed. Someone near Evelyn whispered something to the person beside them. A woman she had known for a decade caught Evelyn's eye from across the room and then immediately looked away. Then Richard turned. He looked directly at Evelyn, and he smiled. Not with cruelty exactly. That would have been cleaner. It was something worse than cruelty. It was dismissal, the smile of a man who believed so completely in his own invulnerability that he felt no need to even hide what he was doing. The smile of someone who had calculated that his wife would absorb the humiliation quietly, the way she had absorbed everything quietly, and tomorrow they would return to their separate routines and life would continue. He raised his glass toward her. "And of course," he said loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear, "to Evelyn, the supportive wife behind the scenes. We couldn't do any of this without you." The nearest people laughed softly, politely, the way people laugh at a joke they don't quite understand. Evelyn raised her own glass. She smiled back at him. And in that moment, something that had been building inside her for a very long time, something patient and quiet and enormously powerful, finally made its decision. She was done protecting him. She turned back to the window and looked out over the Manhattan skyline, and she did the thing she always did when she needed to think clearly. She began to do the math. The diamond necklace. $2 million. She already knew which account it had come from. She had reviewed the trust disbursements 3 weeks ago as part of her quarterly fiduciary review. There had been an unusual withdrawal, $2.1 million from a sub-account of the Carter Family Trust, the legal entity that Evelyn controlled as the sole trustee. The withdrawal had been processed under a category code she had flagged as unusual, but had not yet investigated. Now, she understood. Richard had used trust funds that legally belonged to her family to purchase a gift for his mistress. He had done it in an account she managed, and he had put the evidence of it on public display in front of 500 witnesses. Evelyn took a slow, steady sip of her champagne. She thought about her father, Thomas Carter, who had built his wealth through 40 years of careful, patient, relentless work in commercial real estate, who had established the Carter Family Trust to protect the assets he had built for his daughter and future grandchildren, who had sat across from Richard Hale at a dinner table 17 years ago and said quietly but with absolute clarity, "You understand, Richard, that the money stays in the family. Whatever happens between you and Evelyn, the money stays in the family." And Richard had nodded and shaken Thomas Carter's hand and said, "Of course, I wouldn't have it any other way." Thomas Carter had died 4 years ago. He had never known how comprehensively his son-in-law had ignored that promise. But Evelyn knew. She had known for longer than she had admitted to herself. She finished her champagne, set the glass on a passing tray, and walked quietly through the crowd toward the elevator bank. 3 people tried to stop her to talk business. She smiled at each of them, made a brief, gracious comment, and kept moving. She passed within 10 feet of where Vanessa Blake was standing, laughing with a group of men who were all trying to get as close to her as socially acceptable. She did not look at Vanessa. Vanessa was not her problem. Vanessa was a symptom. Richard was the disease, and the disease had just made itself visible. The elevator opened immediately, as though the building itself understood she was in a hurry. She stepped inside. The doors closed. And for the first time all evening, Evelyn Carter Hale was alone. She reached into her small clutch bag and pulled out her phone. She scrolled to a contact saved simply as Daniel B. and pressed call. It rang twice. "Evelyn." Daniel Brooks answered immediately, his voice carrying the alert quality of a man who had learned over 20 years of working with her that when Evelyn called at unusual hours, it was worth picking up immediately. "What's happening?" "I need you to meet me," she said. Her voice was completely steady. That was something people always noticed about Evelyn in moments of crisis. The steadier she sounded, the more serious the situation was. "Tonight. My private office, not the firm. Bring everything you have on the Carter Trust disbursements from the last 18 months. And Daniel, bring the original licensing agreements. All of them." There was a brief pause. "Evelyn," Daniel said carefully, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I've just decided to stop being invisible." She ended the call as the elevator doors opened on the ground floor lobby. Daniel Brooks had been her personal attorney for 11 years. Before that, he had been her father's attorney. He was 63 years old, had attended Harvard Law, and had spent his career specializing in trust law, intellectual property, and corporate governance. He was the kind of attorney who understood that the most important legal battles were the ones that were won before they ever reached a courtroom. He was waiting for her at the private office when she arrived 40 minutes later. The office was not part of Hale Global. That was deliberate. Evelyn had maintained it for 9 years under the name Carter Financial Advisors, which served officially as the management entity for the Carter Family Trust. It occupied a modest 3-room suite on the 31st floor of a different building 6 blocks east of the Meridian Tower. The office had its own filing system, its own secure servers, its own separate accounting records. Evelyn had built it quietly, systematically. Over nearly a decade, the way she built everything without announcing it, without asking permission, without making herself available to be told no. Daniel was sitting at the conference table with 3 banker's boxes already open in front of him when she walked in. He looked up at her and immediately clocked her expression, or rather the deliberate absence of expression she was maintaining. "Start with the trust disbursements," she said, dropping into the chair across from him and pulling the nearest box toward her. "I need to trace every non-standard withdrawal for the last 18 months and match them to source accounts." "I've already started," Daniel said. He slid a folder across the table. "But Evelyn, before we get into this, what exactly happened tonight?" She told him plainly and without editorializing. The necklace, the public presentation, the account code she had flagged 3 weeks ago. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He used the Meridian sub-account, yes. Evelyn." Daniel's voice changed slightly. It became the voice he used when something was more serious than even he had anticipated. "I've been looking at the Meridian sub-account for the past hour. That's not the only irregular disbursement. There are 7 others, going back 14 months. She looked up from the folder. How much? Daniel told her the number. She held very still. "And that's only the trust," he added. "I haven't gotten to the licensing agreements yet, but based on what I'm seeing in the trust records, I think there may be cross-account transfers that moved money into Hale Global operating accounts without proper authorization." Evelyn looked at the papers in front of her, columns of numbers, dates, account codes, transfer references. The entire architecture of financial manipulation spread out on a conference table in the middle of the night while 500 people were still upstairs in the Meridian Tower applauding her husband's vision. "Pull the original IP licensing agreements," she said. "All of them. Every one I signed, every system I designed, every model I built that was licensed to Hale Global." She paused. "And Daniel, I need to know the current valuation of those licenses, not what Richard has been paying in royalties, what they're actually worth on the open market." Daniel looked at her steadily. He had worked with her long enough to understand when she was shifting from defense to offense. "This is going to be a significant undertaking," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "which is why we should stop talking and start working." They worked through the night. What they uncovered in those first hours was not a single act of financial misconduct. It was a pattern, a slow, careful, years-long pattern of someone who had convinced himself that because he ran the company, because his name was on the building, because every magazine and television program credited him as the visionary, the assets were his. All of them, including the ones that had been legally documented as belonging to someone else. The Carter Family Trust had been established by Thomas Carter with very specific legal protections. Evelyn was the sole trustee. The trust's assets could not be commingled with marital assets, could not be accessed by any party other than Evelyn without her written authorization, and carried a legal protection clause that her father's attorneys had built specifically to guard against what was in technical legal terms called fraudulent conversion. Richard had accessed the trust's sub-accounts multiple times. He had done it through a backdoor authorization structure that his own finance team had built, exploiting a technical gap between Hale Global's banking systems and the Carter Trust's account architecture. He had apparently believed or had convinced himself that because Evelyn never reviewed the sub-accounts with granular regularity, and because she had historically trusted the bank's reporting, the transfers would remain undetected. He was not entirely wrong. They had gone undetected for 14 months. But Evelyn had flagged an anomaly 3 weeks ago, and tonight he had put a $2 million piece of evidence on public display and drawn her attention directly to it. By 4 a.m, Evelyn and Daniel had built a preliminary map of the financial misconduct. It was not complete. It would take weeks of forensic accounting to fully document, but the outline was clear enough that Daniel set down his pen. At one point, leaned back in his chair and said, "Evelyn, you understand what this means for the company." "Yes," she said. "If this goes to litigation or even to regulatory review, I know. The employees. I know Daniel." She said it firmly but not unkindly. "I have thought about the employees every single day for 15 years. I am thinking about them right now. That's why we're going to do this carefully and correctly and in a way that protects them. But I need to know the full scope of what he's done before I can determine the right path forward." Daniel nodded slowly. He trusted her. He had trusted her for 20 years, and in those 20 years, he had never known her to make a decision carelessly or to act from emotion rather than strategy. "Then let me call the forensic accounting firm when they open at 8, he said. "We'll need at least 3 people on this full time." "I'll arrange it," Evelyn said. She looked at the papers spread across the table, at the 15 years of financial history laid bare under conference room lights. At the signatures, she recognized her own, her father's, the attorneys who had worked so carefully to protect what Thomas Carter had built. She thought about Richard upstairs at the party, still smiling, still pouring champagne, still receiving congratulations for a deal that existed because of her work. She thought about the way he had looked at her when he raised his glass. That smile, the smile of a man who believed she would always be invisible. She closed the folder in front of her with quiet, deliberate care. "Let's be very clear about something," she said, not to Daniel specifically, but to the room, to the papers, to the 15 years of silence she was finally ending. "I didn't build all of this so that someone could use it against me, and I am not going to allow that to continue." Daniel said nothing. He simply picked up his pen and kept working. Outside the window, Manhattan moved through the deep part of the night taxis and delivery trucks and the 24-hour machinery of a city that never entirely slept. Somewhere across town, her husband was probably still at the party, still accepting compliments, still believing the empire was his. Evelyn Carter Hale opened the next folder, and she began for the first time in 15 years to take it back. The forensic accounting firm opened at 8 a.m. By 8:03, Evelyn had already spoken to the senior partner. She had not slept. Daniel had managed perhaps 90 minutes on the small couch in the corner of the private office. But Evelyn had stayed at the conference table the entire night, working through folders, cross-referencing account codes, building a timeline that was becoming more damaging with every page she turned. By the time the city outside the window had begun to lighten from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning, she had filled 2 legal pads with notes in her precise, careful handwriting. The forensic firm was called Meridian Audit Partners, which was an irony she did not miss the same word as the tower where Richard had publicly humiliated her 12 hours earlier. She had used the firm twice before for trust audits. They were thorough, discreet, and expensive. All 3 qualities were exactly what she needed. "I need 3 senior analysts," she told the partner, a woman named Carol Vance, whom she had worked with before. "Full forensic review of all Carter family trust accounts going back 5 years, cross-referenced against Hale Global operating accounts for the same period. I need commingling analysis, unauthorized transfer identification, and a full valuation report on licensed intellectual property currently in use by Hale Global Industries." There was a brief pause on the line. Carol Vance was not a woman who rattled easily, but even she took a moment. "Evelyn," she said carefully, "are we talking about what I think we're talking about?" "We are," Evelyn said. "And Carol, I need this treated with complete confidentiality. No communications through any channel connected to Hale Global. No email to any address that routes through their servers. Everything goes through Daniel Brooks at my private office." "Understood," Carol said. "I'll have a team assembled by noon." Evelyn ended the call and looked across the table at Daniel, who was on his third cup of coffee and had the focused, slightly hollowed expression of a man who had been reading financial documents for 6 straight hours. "Carol's sending 3 analysts by noon," she said. Daniel nodded without looking up. "Good, because what I'm finding in these licensing records is going to need more than 3. She walked around the table and looked over his shoulder at the document he was reviewing. The original licensing agreements had been drafted 9 years ago when Evelyn had formalized the arrangement between Carter Financial Advisors and Hale Global Industries. At the time, Richard had needed the licensing structure for technical reasons. The intellectual property she had created was legally hers, not the company's, and in order for Hale Global to use her financial modeling systems, her acquisition frameworks, and her proprietary risk assessment tools in their official operations, they needed a formal licensing arrangement. Richard had agreed to it without reading the full terms, which was a habit of his that Evelyn had long since stopped finding surprising. The terms she had built into those agreements were meticulous. The licensing fees were structured on a sliding scale tied to company revenue. As Hale Global grew, the fees grew proportionally. The agreements included a clause requiring annual third-party valuation of the licensed systems to ensure the fees remained market-appropriate. They included a termination clause that gave Evelyn the right to revoke the licenses with 90 days' notice under specific conditions, including, and this was the language her father's attorney had insisted on, evidence of financial misconduct involving Carter Family Trust assets. Richard had signed every page. He had almost certainly never read them. "Daniel," Evelyn said quietly, still looking at the document in front of him, "what is the current market valuation of the licensed systems?" Daniel flipped to a page he had already marked with a yellow tab. He had done a preliminary calculation using publicly available benchmarks for financial modeling software and proprietary risk assessment tools in the commercial real estate and infrastructure sectors. He told her the number. She straightened up slowly. "That's what they're worth," she said. "And what has Richard been paying in annual licensing fees?" Daniel told her that number too. The difference between the two figures was so large that for a moment neither of them spoke. "He's been underpaying the licensing fees by approximately 70% of market value," Daniel said, "every year for 9 years. Which means—" Evelyn said that Hale Global has been receiving the benefit of systems worth significantly more than what they've been paying for them. And the underpayment represents a financial benefit that flowed directly to the company to Richard's benefit as controlling shareholder at the expense of the trust. "That's correct," Daniel said. "And that's before we get to the unauthorized transfers." She pulled out her chair and sat back down. "Talk to me about the transfers," she said. Daniel organized 3 folders in front of him and began walking her through what he had found. The unauthorized transfers from the Carter Trust sub-accounts had occurred 14 times over a period of 18 months. They ranged in size from $80,000 to $2.1 million, the largest, being, of course, the purchase of the diamond necklace that was currently sitting around Vanessa Blake's neck somewhere across the city. The transfers had been executed through a backdoor authorization pathway that Richard's internal finance director, a man named Gary Tesler, had apparently constructed by exploiting a technical integration between Hale Global's treasury management system and the Carter Trust's banking interface. "Gary Tesler did this," Evelyn said. "The technical execution appears to be Tesler's work," Daniel said. Whether he understood the full legal implications of what he was building, or whether Richard told him it was authorized, I can't say yet. But the authorization codes used were Richard's. Evelyn thought about Gary Tesler. She had met him perhaps a dozen times over the years at company events. He was competent, ambitious, and deeply loyal to Richard in the way that people who owed their career advancement to one person often were. "He'll say Richard told him it was sanctioned," she said. "Almost certainly. And Richard will say it was an accounting error, a miscategorization." "Yes. He'll blame it on a system integration mistake between 2 complex financial entities and claim there was no intent." "That's the defense I'd expect," Daniel agreed. "Which is why the licensing valuation gap is actually the stronger case, because that's 9 years of documented underpayment, 9 years of signed agreements, 9 years of annual reports that show the fee structures. That's not a clerical error. That's a pattern." Evelyn looked at the folders spread across the table. She had a choice to make, and she understood it clearly. She could take what she had to a court, immediately file for emergency protective orders on the trust assets, and begin litigation that would almost certainly become public within days. Or she could continue building the case quietly, allow the forensic team to complete their full analysis, and construct something so comprehensive and so airtight that when she finally moved, it would be impossible to dismiss or delay. The first option was faster. The second was stronger. She had spent 15 years choosing patience over impulse. She was not about to stop now. "We build the full case," she said. "No public moves, no communications with Richard, no signals of any kind until the forensic report is complete and we have a legal strategy ready to execute." Daniel looked at her steadily. "That could take 8 to 10 weeks. Then it takes 8 to 10 weeks. Richard is going to be on television talking about the expansion deal within 48 hours. "Good," she said. "Let him talk. The more he talks about a deal that exists because of my work, the more he establishes the value of what I'm going to reclaim." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's one more thing I need to tell you." Something in his voice made her go still. "I found something in the original Carter Trust documents," he said. "Something I don't think you've looked at recently, because it's buried in the secondary beneficiary provisions that your father added in the final amendment 4 years ago, 3 months before he died." He slid a document across the table. She picked it up and read. Her father had added a provision that she had known about in general terms, but had never examined in precise detail. It established that in the event of documented financial misconduct by any party using or accessing Carter Family Trust assets without proper authorization, the trustee Evelyn had the right to activate what the document called the Strategic Recovery Protocol. The protocol gave her the legal authority to initiate a formal claim not only against the individual responsible for the misconduct, but against any corporate entity that had benefited from it, including the right to demand equity restructuring as a remedy. In plain terms, if someone stole from the trust and a company benefited from that theft, Evelyn could go after the company's ownership structure directly. Hale Global Industries had benefited from 14 unauthorized transfers and 9 years of undervalued licensing arrangements. She read the document twice. Then she set it down. "My father knew," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "He drafted this amendment 4 months after Richard's first major company expansion," Daniel said. "The timing suggests he was watching what was happening and wanted to make sure you had every possible legal tool available if you ever needed it." Thomas Carter had never said a word to her about it. He had simply built the protection and left it there waiting in case she ever needed it. He had known his daughter well enough to understand that she would find it when she was ready. She pressed her hand flat on the document for a moment. Then she said, "Pull every filing we'll need to activate the Strategic Recovery Protocol. I want it ready the moment the forensic report is complete." "Evelyn," Daniel's voice was careful, "if we activate that protocol against Hale Global, we're not just going after Richard personally. We're going after the company's controlling structure. The board will have to respond. The banks will be notified. It will trigger disclosure requirements." "I know. The employees—" "Daniel." She looked at him directly. "My father built that company with me, not with Richard. The employees' jobs are there because of work I did and systems I built. I am not going to let Richard destroy what those people depend on by running it into the ground while stealing from my family's trust. The best thing I can do for those employees is remove the person who is mismanaging and stealing from the entity they work for and replace it with something stable." Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. "You already know what you want to replace it with," he said. She didn't answer immediately. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "I've been building something for 6 years," she said. "Quietly. A separate investment structure properly capitalized with clean governance and a board that I trust. It was never meant for this specific purpose, but it's ready." Daniel stared at her. "You built a company that could absorb Hale Global's controlling structure. I built a company that could absorb whatever it needed to absorb," she said simply. "My father taught me that the best financial preparation is the kind that's ready before you know you need it." The silence in the room lasted about 4 seconds. Then Daniel's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his expression shifted. "It's Richard's office," he said. They both looked at the phone. "Don't answer it," Evelyn said. Daniel let it ring through to voicemail. 40 seconds later, her own phone lit up on the table between them. Richard's personal cell number. She looked at it without expression. She let it ring. He called again 15 minutes later. Then a third time. Then he sent a text that read, "Evelyn, we need to talk. Call me when you're up." It was written in the breezy, confident tone of a man who did not yet understand that the conversation had fundamentally changed. She put the phone face down on the table and went back to the documents. The forensic team arrived at 12:15. Three analysts, led by a senior examiner named Patricia Huang, who had spent 11 years at the SEC before moving to private practice. Patricia Huang had the unhurried, deeply precise manner of someone who had spent a career finding things that other people had worked very hard to hide. She shook Evelyn's hand, looked at the boxes of documents already assembled, and said simply, "Walk me through what you have so far." They spent 3 hours doing exactly that. By the time Patricia's team had their full briefing and had begun their independent review, Evelyn was certain of one thing. She had previously only suspected the scope of what Richard had done was significantly larger than even the first night's review had suggested. Patricia had asked 4 questions during the briefing that opened entirely new lines of investigation, questions about intercompany loan structures, questions about how certain acquisition costs had been categorized, questions about the relationship between Hale Global's European expansion financing and the Carter Trust's investment portfolio. Each question landed in the room like a stone dropping into deep water. The ripples kept expanding. By 5 p.m, Patricia pulled Evelyn aside. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said in the careful, measured tone of someone delivering serious information. "Based on what I've reviewed in the first 3 hours, this is not a simple case of financial irregularity. What your attorney has identified as the surface issues appear to be connected to a much more complex structure of asset misappropriation. I'm not in a position to give you final conclusions yet, but I want you to understand the scope of what we may be looking at." Evelyn said, "Tell me." Patricia told her. The number she described the total potential value of the misappropriated and undervalued assets was not $2 million. It was not even $20 million. The figure Patricia outlined as a preliminary conservative estimate was large enough that Evelyn was grateful she was sitting down. She kept her face completely composed. "How long to complete the full forensic report?" she asked. "If we run 3 teams, 7 weeks, Patricia said. "If you want it in 5 weeks, I'll need 2 additional analysts." "Hire them," Evelyn said, "whatever the cost. 5 weeks. Patricia nodded and returned to her team. Evelyn sat alone for a moment at the end of the conference table. She thought about Richard, who was probably right now in his office on the 54th floor preparing his expansion announcement, talking points for tomorrow's press conference. Confident, polished, completely unaware that 6 floors below him, 11 hours ago, his wife had begun the most thorough financial investigation of his career. She thought about the way he had grabbed her wrist at the party, the bruise that was still there hidden under the sleeve of the blouse she had changed into this morning, the casual, thoughtless cruelty of it, the way he had done it without even registering that it was a thing he was doing. She thought about her father. She thought about 15 years. And then she stopped thinking about any of it and picked up the next document because there was too much work to do and emotion was a luxury she could not afford right now. 2 days later, Richard called Daniel Brooks directly. Daniel told Evelyn immediately. "He wants to know if you're all right," Daniel said, and his tone made it clear what he thought of that framing. "He said you haven't been home and you're not answering his calls and he's concerned." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were engaged in trust management matters and would be in touch when you were available." "Good," she said. "Did he push back?" He said, and I'm quoting exactly, "Dan, whatever Evelyn is working on, I need her focused right now. We're in the middle of the biggest deal in company history, and I need her head in the game." Evelyn looked at Daniel for a moment. Then she said, "He called you Dan." "He always does. He thinks it creates familiarity." "He's nervous," she said. "He doesn't know what I know yet, but something is telling him to pay attention. He can feel the shift." She paused. "Good. Let him feel it. Don't give him anything." 3 weeks into the forensic review, something unexpected happened. One of Patricia Huang's analysts discovered a series of transactions that nobody had been looking for. Not because they were hidden, they were hiding in plain sight, buried in a category of Hale Global's accounts labeled Strategic Investment Reserve, which sounded official and important and had apparently never been questioned by the company's own internal auditors. What the Strategic Investment Reserve actually contained was a private account that Richard had been using for nearly 4 years to fund a parallel investment venture. An independent company structured in Delaware, registered under a name that bore no obvious connection to Hale Global or to Richard personally. A company that had been receiving regular transfers from Hale Global's corporate accounts transfers, categorized as consulting fees, paid to an external advisory firm. The external advisory firm did not exist. The consulting fees were going directly into the private company which Richard controlled through a third-party nominee structure specifically designed to conceal his ownership. Patricia Huang delivered this information to Evelyn and Daniel on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting across the table with the steady expression of someone who had seen serious financial misconduct before, but was not unmoved by the scale of what she was presenting. "The parallel company has assets," Patricia said. "Properties, investment accounts, and cash. Based on the transfer history, approximately $40 million has moved into this structure over the past 4 years. The room was completely quiet. Then Daniel said very slowly, "He was building a separate financial life." "That appears to be the case," Patricia said. Evelyn looked at the documents in front of her, at the evidence of a man who had not merely cheated on his wife and stolen from her family's trust, a man who had been systematically building an escape route, a separate fortune, a hidden structure, a financial parallel universe he could disappear into if the primary empire ever became inconvenient. She understood something in that moment that she had not fully understood before. Richard had not been careless. He had not made mistakes out of arrogance or thoughtlessness, though he had been both arrogant and thoughtless. He had been deliberately constructing a situation in which no matter what happened, he would be protected. The public company, the fame, the marriage, these were the front. The hidden company was the real plan. He had thought of everything, except for the woman he had dismissed as invisible. Evelyn placed both hands flat on the table. She looked at Patricia. She looked at Daniel. "Every transaction," she said, "every transfer, every corporate filing, every nominee structure, every shell. I want it documented, verified, and ready to present to the board with the full forensic report." Patricia said, "You're going to the board directly." "I'm going to the board," Evelyn said, "and I'm going to give them exactly 2 choices. A structured, orderly transition that protects the employees and the investors, or a regulatory referral that will bring every agency with jurisdiction down on this company simultaneously." Daniel leaned forward. "Evelyn, if you go to the board with this, you cannot control how fast it moves. Richard will know within hours. He'll lawyer up immediately. He may try to move assets. He may try to—" "He won't have time," she said. Daniel stopped. "The board meeting," she said. "The quarterly governance review is in 4 weeks. I'm on the agenda as a trust officer with standing to address financial governance matters. I've been on that agenda for 6 years, and I have never once used it. I'm going to use it now." She paused. "And before I walk into that room, I will have filed emergency protective orders on every Carter Trust asset, every licensed IP agreement, and every corporate account with commingled funds. By the time Richard understands what is happening, the legal architecture will already be in place around him." Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then he said something he had said only once before in 20 years of working with her. "Your father would have been proud of you." Evelyn looked at him. She did not let herself feel it fully. Not yet. There was still too much work to do. But something moved through her, quiet and strong and enormously steady, like a river that has been running underground for a very long time and has finally, without apology, found its way to the surface. "Then let's make sure we do it right," she said, and they went back to work. The emergency protective orders were filed at 7:42 in the morning on a Thursday 3 days before the quarterly board meeting. Evelyn had been awake since 4, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she had chosen not to. She had spent those early hours doing the things she always did when she was preparing for something that mattered. She had gone back to the beginning. She had read every document from the first night again, every transfer record, every licensing agreement, Every page of Patricia Huang's completed forensic report, which had arrived in a sealed digital file 48 hours earlier, and which Evelyn had read 3 times, cover to cover, until she could recite its key findings from memory. The protective orders covered 7 categories of assets. Carter Family Trust, accounts all of them frozen against any unauthorized access. The intellectual property licensing agreements suspended pending review of the fee valuation dispute. 4 specific Hale Global operating accounts that forensic analysis had identified as containing commingled trust funds, the Delaware company Richard had built in secret, the nominee structure he had used to conceal his ownership, and the $40 million in assets that had been funded through fraudulent consulting fee transfers. Daniel had filed in 2 jurisdictions simultaneously: federal court for the IP claims, state court for the trust violations, 2 judges, 2 sets of emergency motions, all filed before Richard Hale's workday began. At 8:15, Richard's personal attorney called Daniel's office. At 8:17, Richard himself called Evelyn's cell phone. She was sitting at this conference table in her private office with Daniel and Patricia Huang when the call came through. She looked at the screen. She looked at Daniel. She set the phone face down on the table and said, "Where are we on the board notification?" "Sent at 7:55, Daniel said. "Certified delivery to all 11 board members and the board chairwoman Margaret Whitmore directly." "And the banks?" "Notified simultaneously with the court filings. They've already placed compliance holds on the flagged accounts." Richard called again. Then again. Then his attorney called Daniel again, and this time Daniel picked up, listened for 45 seconds, said, "My client will address all matters through the board governance process as scheduled," and hung up. Evelyn looked at Daniel. "How did the attorney sound?" she asked. "Angry," Daniel said, "but underneath the anger scared, which means Richard has seen the filings and he understands at least some of what they mean." "He doesn't understand all of it yet," Evelyn said quietly. "He won't fully understand until he's sitting in that boardroom." Patricia Huang closed her laptop and folded her hands on the table. "The report is as complete as I can make it," she said. "Every finding is documented to evidentiary standard. Every number has a source trail. Every transaction has been independently verified by at least 2 members of my team." She paused. "I've been doing forensic accounting for 22 years, Evelyn. This is one of the most comprehensive cases of systematic asset misappropriation I have reviewed at the private corporate level. The board will not be able to dismiss this." Evelyn nodded once. "Thank you, Patricia." She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city for exactly 30 seconds. Then she turned back around. 3 days, she said. "Let's make sure we're ready." Those 3 days moved differently than any other period in Evelyn's memory. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. The hours of preparation felt both endless and desperately short, and underneath all of it ran a current of tension, so constant that she had almost stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing the sound of traffic when you've lived in a city long enough. Richard did not stay quiet. On the first day, his attorney sent a formal letter to Daniel's office, characterizing the protective orders as a unilateral and legally questionable action taken without proper notice, and demanding immediate withdrawal. Daniel filed a response in 40 minutes that cited 4 specific statutes, 2 case precedents, and the exact language of the Strategic Recovery Protocol that Thomas Carter had added to the trust documents 3 months before his death. Richard's attorney did not respond to the response. On the second day, Richard attempted a different approach. He called Evelyn's sister Caroline, who lived in Connecticut, and who had always maintained careful neutrality in the marriage. He told Caroline that Evelyn was having some kind of breakdown, that she had been working too hard and wasn't sleeping properly, and had made some very serious legal mistakes that were going to damage the family. He asked Caroline to talk to her. Caroline called Evelyn immediately after. "He called me," Caroline said, and her voice was already tense with something between anger and disbelief. "He actually called me and told me you were having a breakdown. Evelyn, what is happening? Are you all right?" "I am completely fine," Evelyn said. "Better than I have been in years, actually. Did he say anything specific about the legal actions?" "He said you filed some kind of orders that are hurting the company and that you didn't understand the implications." I understand the implications precisely, Evelyn said. Caroline, I need you to trust me, and I need you to stay out of this for now. Not because I don't love you, because what I'm doing is going to become public in 2 days, and I don't want you in the middle of it. There was a pause. Evelyn, Caroline said quietly, how bad is it? What did he do? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he used Dad's trust money to buy his mistress a diamond necklace, and that was the least of it. The silence that followed lasted a full 10 seconds. Then Caroline said in a voice that had gone absolutely flat and cold, Tell me what you need from me. Stay available, Evelyn said. I'll call you the moment the board meeting is over. She hung up and went back to preparing her presentation. On the third day, the day before the board meeting, something happened that nobody had anticipated. One of Hale Global's board members, a man named Charles Elliott, who had been on the board for 12 years and who Evelyn had always considered one of Richard's most loyal supporters, called her private office directly. He asked to speak with her personally, not through attorneys. Evelyn took the call in the small side room off the main conference area alone with the door closed. Evelyn, Charles Elliott said. He was 71 years old, a former investment banker, and had the deliberate, unhurried speech of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing words carefully. I received the board notification 3 days ago. I've spent the last 72 hours reviewing the materials your attorney provided. And, she said, and I want you to know, he said slowly, that what I've read in those materials has troubled me deeply. I've known Richard for 20 years. I considered him a friend. But what's documented in that forensic report, if it holds under further scrutiny, is not something I can look past. Evelyn said nothing. She let him talk. I'm not calling to negotiate, Elliott continued. I'm calling because I want you to know that when you walk into that room tomorrow, you will not be walking in alone. I've spoken with 3 other board members. Margaret Whitmore has been reviewing the materials since the moment she received them. She called me yesterday evening. He paused. Margaret is not a woman who calls board members the evening before a meeting unless something significant is about to happen. No, Evelyn agreed. She isn't. Be ready, Charles Elliott said. And Evelyn, for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened to you. She thanked him and ended the call. She sat alone in the small room for about 2 minutes after that. She thought about what Charles Elliott had just told her. 4 board members. Margaret Whitmore. The board had 11 members total. Richard held the CEO chair, but not a board seat. He attended meetings by standing invitation, not by vote. If Margaret Whitmore, as board chairwoman, had decided to move against him, the procedural authority to do so was entirely within her power. Evelyn had not reached out to any board member directly before the filing. She had sent the materials and allowed them to draw their own conclusions. The fact that 4 members had already privately aligned before the meeting meant that the forensic report had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had spoken for itself. She went back to the main room and told Daniel what Elliott had said. Daniel set down his pen. 4 members before the meeting even starts, he said. Evelyn, this is going to move faster than we planned. Good, she said. The board meeting was called for 10 in the morning. Evelyn arrived at 9:45. She had chosen her clothes with the same deliberate care she had applied to everything else over the past 5 weeks. A charcoal gray suit precisely fitted. No jewelry except her father's watch, which she had worn on her wrist every day since he died. She carried a slim leather portfolio that contained a single printed copy of her prepared remarks, though she doubted she would need to read from it. She had memorized everything. The boardroom was on the 52nd floor of the Meridian Tower, 2 floors below the gala, where 5 weeks ago Richard had clasped diamonds around Vanessa Blake's neck and called Evelyn invisible. The symmetry was not lost on her. She rode the elevator up alone. When the doors opened, she could see from the corridor that the boardroom was already filling. Board members were arriving, the low murmur of pre-meeting conversation audible through the partially open glass door. 2 of Richard's senior executives were standing near the assistant's desk outside the room, talking in tight, anxious clusters. One of them saw Evelyn step off the elevator and immediately pulled out his phone. She walked past them without speaking. Richard was already in the room. He was standing at the far end of the boardroom table talking with 2 board members, and when he saw Evelyn walk through the door, something crossed his face that she had rarely seen there before. Not guilt. Richard was not a man who experienced guilt with any regularity. Not anger either, though the anger was there underneath. What she saw for just a fraction of a second before his practiced composure reassembled itself was something much more revealing. Fear. He covered it immediately. He straightened. He smiled. He said in the voice he used when he wanted to appear relaxed and in control, "Evelyn, I'm glad you're here. We should talk before this starts." She looked at him directly. "We'll talk in the meeting," she said, and walked to the opposite side of the table. Margaret Whitmore called the meeting to order at 10:03. Margaret was 67 years old, a former federal appellate judge who had moved into corporate governance after 20 years on the bench. She was small, silver-haired, and carried the specific quality of authority that comes not from volume or aggression, but from the absolute certainty that every word she speaks will be taken seriously. She had been board chairwoman of Hale Global for 8 years. In those 8 years, Evelyn had watched her preside over dozens of meetings with the same measured, implacable calm. Today that calm had a different quality to it, sharper, more deliberate. "We have one substantive matter on today's agenda," Margaret said after the standard procedural opening, which is a formal governance review initiated under Article 7 of the Hale Global Corporate Charter, triggered by the filing of legal protective orders affecting company assets and connected financial structures. I'll turn the floor first to Evelyn Carter Hale, who has standing as trust officer and licensed IP holder, to address the board directly. Richard's jaw tightened visibly. He had expected to speak first. He had almost certainly prepared an opening statement designed to characterize everything Evelyn had done as a misunderstanding, a legal error, a temporary crisis that he was already working to resolve. He had not expected Margaret Whitmore to hand the floor to Evelyn before he had said a single word. Evelyn opened her portfolio. She began speaking. She spoke for 22 minutes without stopping. She did not raise her voice. She did not editorialize or dramatize. She presented the forensic findings exactly as Patricia Huang had documented them, clearly, sequentially, with the precise figures and the precise source references for each finding. She explained the Carter family trust structure, the licensing agreements, the 14 unauthorized transfers, the 9 years of fee underpayment, and the hidden Delaware company with the $40 million in assets funded through fraudulent consulting fees. She presented each finding as a fact supported by documentation verified by independent forensic review. The room grew quieter with each minute that passed. By the time she finished, the only sound was the soft mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system. Richard said, "This is a gross mischaracterization of Richard." Margaret Whitmore said his name in a tone that stopped him completely. One word, 2 syllables, absolute authority. "You will have the opportunity to respond. You will wait." He stopped. Margaret looked at the board members on either side of her. Questions for Mrs. Carter Hale. There were 7 questions. They came from 5 different board members, all of them specific, all of them directed at the forensic findings. Evelyn answered each one without hesitation. She knew the numbers. She knew the dates. She knew the account codes, the transfer references, the contractual language of every agreement. She had lived inside this material for 5 weeks. After the 7th question, a board member named Susan Park, who handled governance compliance and who Evelyn had always found rigorous and fair, said quietly, "The forensic report, has it been reviewed for completeness by outside counsel?" "Yes," Evelyn said. 2 independent law firms. Both opinions are in the materials your board packet." Susan Park sat back and looked at the table. That was the moment Evelyn knew it was over for Richard. Not the 22-minute presentation, not the forensic report. The moment a careful, procedurally rigorous board member sat back and looked at the table that was the moment. Richard spoke for 11 minutes. He was polished. He was confident. He used words like context and complexity and long-standing internal accounting practices. He said that the trust account issues were the result of a systems integration error that his finance team was already reviewing. He said the licensing fee structure had always been mutually agreed upon. He said the Delaware company was a personal investment vehicle that had no bearing on corporate governance. He was good. He had always been good at this. The voice, the posture, the measured certainty. In any other room on any other day, it might have worked. But he was speaking after Evelyn, and the numbers had already spoken. When Richard finished, Charles Elliott spoke. He said in his deliberate, measured way that the documentation presented by Evelyn was the most serious governance concern he had encountered in 12 years on this board, and that in his view, the board had both the obligation and the authority to act immediately. Then a second board member supported Elliott's position, then a third. Richard's attorney, who had been permitted to attend in an advisory capacity, leaned over and began speaking urgently into Richard's ear. Richard's expression cycled through 3 distinct emotional states in about 15 seconds: calculation, anger, and something that looked very much like the beginning of genuine alarm. He said, "Margaret, I need to request a recess, 30 minutes, to consult with counsel." Margaret Whitmore looked at him steadily. "The board will take a 15-minute recess," she said. 15 minutes, Richard." The room moved into the controlled chaos of a recess during a serious proceeding. People stood, spoke, and low voices checked phones. Richard moved to the corner with his attorney and 2 of his senior executives. Evelyn moved to the windows with Daniel, who had been permitted into the room as her legal representative. Daniel said quietly, "4 members have spoken in support. Margaret hasn't shown her hand yet, but Elliott told you she called him yesterday. Evelyn, I think she's going to move for a formal resolution." "She is," Evelyn said. "She made up her mind before this meeting started." "How do you know?" "Because she called the meeting as a governance review under Article 7, Evelyn said. "Not as a CEO performance review, not as a financial audit request. Article 7 is the structural intervention article. She chose the legal framework before she walked into this room." Daniel looked at her. "You knew she would do this." "I hoped she would see what the materials required her to see," Evelyn said. "Margaret Whitmore spent 20 years as a federal judge. She knows what evidence looks like." Across the room, Richard was talking rapidly to his attorney, his voice too low to hear, but his body language unmistakable. Tense, urgent, a man trying to find a move that doesn't exist. Evelyn watched him for a moment. She felt something that surprised her slightly. Not satisfaction, not triumph, something quieter and more complicated. She felt the strange, specific sadness of watching someone she had once loved demonstrate in real time exactly who they had always been. The recess ended. Margaret Whitmore called the room back to order. She said, "The board has reviewed the materials presented today in conjunction with the independently verified forensic report filed with this board 3 days ago. The findings document a pattern of financial conduct that is inconsistent with the fiduciary duties of the chief executive, and that has caused material harm to connected financial entities with legal standing against this corporation." Richard started to speak. Margaret continued as though he had not. Under Article 7 of the Hale Global Corporate Charter, the board has the authority to initiate a structured governance transition when the board determines that continued leadership by the current chief executive presents unacceptable legal and financial risk to the company, its employees, its investors, and its partners. She paused. "I am placing a formal motion on the table to initiate that transition. The motion includes the following elements: immediate suspension of Richard Hale's executive authority pending completion of legal proceedings, appointment of a temporary executive oversight committee drawn from current board members, engagement of an independent investment banking firm to design a structured ownership transition that protects employee interests, investor value, and partner relationships, all elements to be executed within 60 days. The room was absolutely silent. Richard stood up. "You cannot do this," he said. His voice had lost its practiced smoothness. Underneath the composure he had been maintaining all morning, something raw had finally surfaced. "I built this company. I have given 20 years to this company. You cannot sit in this room and take it from me based on such Richard." Margaret's voice did not rise. It never rose. That was what made it so devastating. "The vote, please." The vote was 8-2. 1 abstention. Richard sat back down. His attorney put a hand on his arm. Richard did not move for a long moment. He looked at the table in front of him. He looked at the board members who had just voted against him. He looked finally across the table at Evelyn. She met his gaze steadily. There was no triumph in her face, no cruelty, no satisfaction displayed for the room. She simply looked at her husband with the same steady, clear attention she had brought to every document and every meeting and every decision over the past 5 weeks. His expression shifted through something she couldn't fully name. Anger was there. Humiliation was there. And underneath both of them, just barely visible, something she had not seen on Richard's face in a very long time. Recognition. Not of what he had done. She wasn't certain he was capable of that yet. But recognition of her, of what she was, of what she had always been working quietly in the background of the empire he had taken credit for. He looked away first. Margaret Whitmore closed the meeting at 12:17. Outside the boardroom in the corridor, the national business press was already assembled. Someone had leaked that the meeting was significant. Evelyn had anticipated this. She walked out of the boardroom with Daniel beside her, moved through the cluster of journalists without stopping, and said only, "A statement will be released through our legal representatives this afternoon," before stepping into the waiting elevator. As the elevator doors closed, she heard one reporter calling out, "Mrs. Carter Hale, can you confirm that you're taking control of Hale Global?" The doors closed. She looked at Daniel. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone waiting to see how a person responds to the most significant moment of their professional life. She took a slow breath. Then she said, "Call the investment bank. Tell them we're ready to start the transition design. And Daniel, call the employment law firm. I want employment protections built into the transition structure from day one. No employee loses their position because of what Richard did." Daniel was already reaching for his phone. "And the statement for the press?" he asked. Evelyn thought for a moment. "Keep it simple," she said. "Say that the board has acted appropriately to protect the company's stakeholders. Say that the transition is designed to preserve employee security and investor value. Say nothing about Richard personally." She paused. "And say nothing about me." Daniel looked up. "Nothing about you. This isn't about me," she said. "It never was." The elevator reached the lobby. She walked out into the city, into the ordinary noise and motion of a midday Manhattan street, and for the first time in 5 weeks, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not with triumph, not with the electric, brittle energy of victory, with something steadier, something that felt underneath all the exhaustion and the grief and the strange, complicated relief, very much like the beginning of something she had not yet fully named. The statement went out at 2:47 in the afternoon. Daniel had drafted it in the car on the way back to the private office, reading sections aloud to Evelyn for approval, while Manhattan moved past the windows. It was 11 sentences long. It confirmed the board's governance action. It affirmed the company's commitment to employee security and investor protection. It named the investment banking firm Castellan Advisory Group, one of the most respected restructuring specialists in the country, as the transition architect. It said nothing about Richard beyond confirming the suspension of his executive authority. It said nothing about Evelyn at all. By 3:15, every major financial news outlet in the country had picked it up. By 3:40, Hale Global's stock had moved. Daniel was watching the ticker on his laptop when the first significant shift appeared. He turned the screen toward Evelyn without speaking. She looked at it. The initial reaction was a drop predictable, the market responding to uncertainty, the way markets always do with reflexive alarm. But then within 20 minutes, something different happened. The stock stabilized, and then slowly it began to recover. Castellan, Daniel said simply, meaning that the market had recognized the name of the restructuring firm and understood that a serious, experienced hand was now on the situation. "Good," Evelyn said. She went back to the document she was reviewing. She had not stopped working. The board vote had ended one phase and begun another, and in some ways the second phase was more complex than the first. The transition design, the actual mechanics of how Hale Global's controlling structure would be reorganized, required precision that matched or exceeded everything that had come before. Because this was the part that would determine whether the 2,314 employees who worked for Hale Global kept their jobs, their benefits, and their retirement security. And that mattered to Evelyn in a way that went beyond strategy. She knew most of their names. That was not something Richard had ever understood about her. While he had been attending galas and posing for magazine covers, she had been in the offices, in the operations centers, in the regional branches. She had learned the names of the analysts and the administrative staff and the project managers because she believed that understanding a company meant understanding its people, not just its numbers. And now those people's futures depended on what she built in the next 60 days. She was not going to get it wrong. At 4:30, her phone rang. Not Richard's number, not his attorney's. A number she recognized as belonging to Gary Tesler, Richard's finance director, the man who had built the backdoor authorization pathway used to access the Carter Trust accounts. She looked at the number for a moment, then she answered. "Mrs. Carter Hale," Gary Tesler said. His voice was tight-controlled and carrying beneath its surface the specific quality of a man who has spent the past 6 hours understanding exactly how exposed he is. "I know you have no reason to take this call. I appreciate that you did." "What do you want, Gary?" she said. "I want to cooperate," he said, "with the forensic review, with whatever legal process follows. I want to provide full documentation of every instruction I received and every authorization I was given for the transfers." He paused. "I need you to understand I was told those transfers were sanctioned. Richard told me they were an internal restructuring of connected entities and that you were aware of them." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Did he put that in writing?" "No," Gary said. "But I have emails. I have internal communications. I have a record of every conversation I had with Richard about those accounts going back 2 years." "Gary," she said carefully, "you need to be speaking with your own attorney before you have this conversation with me." "I have an attorney," he said. "My attorney told me to make this call. We want to proactively cooperate before the regulatory referrals go out." Another pause, shorter this time. "Are the regulatory referrals going out?" "That depends on how the transition proceeds," she said. It was the most she was willing to say. "Have your attorney contact Daniel Brooks, today if possible." She ended the call. Gary Tesler's cooperation changed several things. It confirmed what she had already suspected, that Richard had deliberately misled his own finance director, had used a trusted employee as an instrument of misconduct without fully disclosing what was actually being done. It added a layer of documentation that would make the legal case against Richard individually even more comprehensive. And it meant that Gary Tesler, who had a family and a career and had apparently believed he was acting on authorized instructions, could be dealt with fairly rather than being made a casualty of someone else's dishonesty. She told Daniel about the call the moment she walked back into the main room. Daniel looked up from his laptop. "Tesler is cooperating. His attorney reached out 30 seconds ago," Daniel said, looking at his phone. "The email just came in." He read quickly. "They want a proffer agreement, complete cooperation in exchange for limited personal liability on the civil claims. Talk to Patricia Huang about what Tesler's documentation would add to the forensic record," Evelyn said. "If it strengthens the case against Richard and gives us cleaner protection for the company going forward, agree to the proffer." "Agreed," Daniel said. He was already typing. The first call from Castellan Advisory Group came in at 5:08. The senior partner, a man named Edward Marsh, who had led some of the most complex corporate restructurings in recent American business history, spoke for 40 minutes with Evelyn and Daniel about the transition framework. He was precise, efficient, and asked questions that told Evelyn immediately that he had already reviewed the board materials thoroughly. At the end of the call, Edward Marsh said, "Mrs. Carter Hale, I want to ask you directly about the acquisition entity. The board materials reference a separate investment structure with standing to acquire the controlling interests. Can you confirm that entity is adequately capitalized and has clean governance documentation?" "Yes to both," she said. "Name of the entity?" "Carter Ridge Capital," she said. It was the name she had chosen 6 years ago, sitting at a different desk in a different office building, something she had told herself was general financial preparation, and had known somewhere beneath the telling was something more specific than that. "We'll need full capitalization documentation and governance filings by end of business tomorrow," Marsh said. "You'll have them by noon," she said. She spent that evening at the private office with her accountant and the attorney who had incorporated Carter Ridge Capital 6 years earlier, assembling the documentation package. She worked until 11 at night. She had eaten a sandwich at her desk at 7. She had called Caroline once briefly to confirm she was all right and to give her a condensed version of what had happened in the boardroom. Caroline had cried. Evelyn had not, though she had come close when Caroline said, "Dad knew you would handle it. He always knew." At 11:15, she went home. It was the first time she had been in the apartment in 6 weeks. She had been staying at a hotel 4 blocks from the private office, not because she feared Richard, but because she had not been ready to inhabit the same physical space as 15 years of a marriage she was simultaneously dismantling and grieving. She had collected what she needed in the first week, personal documents, her father's watch, certain files, and had not returned. The apartment was quiet. Richard was not there. She had no idea where he was staying and had not asked. She moved through the room slowly, not with the searching quality of someone looking for something, but with the deliberate attention of someone doing inventory. Looking at 15 years of shared life with the clear, unsentimental eyes of someone who has already made her decision and is now simply completing the accounting. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. She thought about a morning 12 years ago when she had sat at that kitchen table and finished the acquisition model that had made Hale Global's first major infrastructure deal possible. Richard had come in, poured coffee, looked at her laptop screen, and said, "What's all that?" she had explained. He had nodded, said, "Good, send it to the finance team," and left for the office. He had presented the model to investors that afternoon as his own work. She had told herself it didn't matter because they were a team. She had told herself that for a long time. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The next 6 weeks moved at a pace she had not experienced in years. The transition design required daily calls with Castellan weekly board updates, continuous legal coordination across 3 law firms and 2 jurisdictions, and parallel management of the divorce proceedings that she had formally initiated on the same morning as the protective orders. The divorce attorney was a woman named Sandra Reese, who was known in legal circles as someone who could handle cases of extraordinary complexity without becoming either emotional or brutal, the 2 qualities Evelyn had specifically sought. Richard had responded to the divorce filing with a legal team of 4 attorneys who immediately challenged the protective orders, the forensic findings, the board's authority under Article 7, and the valuation methodology used for the licensed intellectual property. The challenges were comprehensive, expensive, and almost entirely unsuccessful. Each one was answered by Daniel's team with the precise documented evidence that 5 weeks of intensive investigation had built. Richard's legal team was fighting hard, but they were fighting against paper trails, and paper trails do not negotiate. 3 weeks into the transition process, the twist that nobody had anticipated arrived in the form of a phone call from Edward Marsh at 7 in the morning. Evelyn was already at the private office when the call came. She had been there since 6. "There's a development," Marsh said without preamble. That was something she had come to appreciate about him. He did not soften things. "Richard's attorney contacted us last night. Richard wants to negotiate directly, not through the board process, directly with you." Evelyn was quiet. "What specifically does he want to negotiate?" she asked. "He wants to retain a minority equity position in the restructured entity," Marsh said. "He's proposing to drop all legal challenges to the protective orders and the board resolution in exchange for a 15% stake in Carter Ridge Capital's acquisition structure." She stood up from her desk. She walked to the window. She thought about this for exactly 30 seconds. "No," she said. "Evelyn, no minority position, no equity stake, no ongoing connection between Richard Hale and any entity involved in this transition." She paused. "Edward, the employees of this company deserve a governance structure that isn't complicated by the legal and ethical history of the person who mismanaged it. A 15% stake for Richard is 15% of a reason for the next regulatory review to look at this company's history. I won't do it." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "He'll escalate the legal challenges." "Let him," she said. "The forensic report and Gary Tesler's cooperation documentation will answer every challenge he files. It will take longer. It will cost more. But the answer is no." Marsh said, "I'll communicate that to his attorney." "And Edward," she added, "tell them that the employee protection provisions are non-negotiable regardless of how Richard responds. Whatever he decides to do legally, those provisions stay in the transition structure. That's not a bargaining chip." "Understood," Marsh said. She ended the call. Daniel, who had heard her side of the conversation, looked up from his desk. He wanted a stake in Carter Ridge, 15%. Daniel made a sound that was not quite a laugh. After everything he did, he still thinks he gets a seat at the table. He spent 20 years believing the table was his by right, Evelyn said. That doesn't change overnight. She picked up the next document in her stack. It won't matter. His legal challenges are going to fail. Patricia Huang's report is airtight, and Tesler's cooperation fills every gap Richard's attorneys might try to exploit. She was right. It took 18 more days, 4 additional court filings, and 1 emergency motion that Richard's team brought before a federal judge at 7 in the morning and lost by 10:30. After the emergency motion failed, Richard's lead attorney called Daniel, and in the careful, flat language of a lawyer delivering a final position, said that Richard was prepared to accept the board's transition resolution in full withdrawal all pending legal challenges, and cooperate with the remaining forensic review in exchange for a settlement agreement that addressed his personal financial exposure. Daniel called Evelyn immediately. "He's surrendering," Daniel said. She was in a meeting with the Castellan team. She stepped into the corridor. "What are the terms he's proposing for the settlement?" she asked. Daniel walked her through it. Richard would cooperate fully. He would sign the necessary documentation to execute the ownership transition. He would make no public statements disparaging the process or any of the parties involved. In exchange, the referral to federal regulatory authorities, which was still pending, held in reserve as exactly the kind of leverage it had always been intended to be, would be withdrawn. And the civil claims against him personally would be resolved through a private financial settlement rather than litigation. Evelyn listened to all of it. Then she said, "The regulatory referral stays on the table until every document is signed and every element of the transition is complete, not before. He doesn't get certainty about the referral until we have certainty about the execution." "That's a hard line," Daniel said. "His attorneys are going to push back." "They can push back," she said. "Tell them the answer is yes to cooperation, yes to settlement structure, no to withdrawing the regulatory referral until full completion. Those are the terms. They're not moving." The terms did not move. Richard's attorneys accepted them 48 hours later. The signing ceremony, if it could be called that which it could not, because it was a series of document executions spread across 3 separate legal offices in 2 cities over 4 days, concluded on a Thursday afternoon in early spring, 61 days after the board meeting. 61 days after Margaret Whitmore had called a vote, and 8 board members had looked at the evidence Evelyn had built and understood what it required them to do. Evelyn signed the final document in Daniel's conference room. It was the acquisition agreement that transferred the controlling interest in Hale Global's operating structure to Carter Ridge Capital. She signed it with her father's pen, a simple black ballpoint that Thomas Carter had used for every significant signature of his professional life, and that she had kept in her desk drawer for the 4 years since his death. Daniel witnessed the signature. Then he said, "It's done." She looked at the document for a moment. She thought about the night of the gala, the diamonds, the bruise on her wrist, the elevator doors closing, and the decision that had crystallized in the quiet between floors. She thought about the conference table covered in folders at 4 in the morning. She thought about her father writing a legal provision into a trust document 3 months before he died and not saying a word to her about it because he had trusted her to find it when she needed it. She thought about 2,314 people who still had their jobs. She capped the pen. "What happens to Richard now?" Daniel asked quietly. It was not a legal question. It was the kind of question a person asks when they have spent 2 months watching something enormous unfold and want to understand its full human weight. "He has money," she said. "Not what he expected to have, not what he thought was his, but he's not destitute. He made choices, and those choices have consequences, but the consequences are proportionate." She paused. "What happens to him is up to him. That's not my responsibility anymore." She stood up and picked up her portfolio. "Send the press statement," she said, "and Daniel the one about the Carter Foundation. I want that one out today, too." He looked up. "The foundation announcement today." "Today," she said. "The transition is complete. There's no reason to wait." The second press statement went out 40 minutes later. It announced the establishment of the Carter Foundation for Financial Independence, a nonprofit organization capitalized with a portion of the settlement recovery from the Carter family trust claims. The foundation's stated mission was to provide financial education, legal guidance, and practical resources to women navigating contracts, business ownership trusts, and financial rights. It would operate nationally, with regional offices in 6 cities in its first year. The response to that statement was something Evelyn had not entirely anticipated. By the following morning, more than 400 women had contacted the foundation's newly established email address, not to apply for services, to share their own stories of financial manipulation in marriages and business partnerships and family structures, stories of women who had built things and watched other people take credit, stories of women who had stayed quiet because they believed that was what was required of them. Evelyn read every one of them. She read them at her desk in the private office, now officially rebranded as Carter Ridge Capital's executive headquarters, in the early morning hours before the workday began. She read them the way she had read everything over the past 2 months, with full attention, with the specific quality of someone who understands that information is not abstract, that every number in a financial document represents a person's actual life. When her assistant knocked on the door at 8:30 to tell her that the first full board meeting of Carter Ridge Capital was ready to begin, Evelyn closed her laptop, straightened her jacket, and stood up. Her assistant, a young woman named Maya, who had worked with her for 3 years and had navigated the past 2 months with remarkable steadiness, said, "How are you doing, honestly?" Evelyn looked at her. It was the kind of question that could have 100 answers, depending on which layer of the truth you chose to speak. She chose the truest one. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. "Let's go." She walked down the corridor toward the boardroom of the company she had built. The company she had built quietly and carefully over 6 years, while everyone was watching a different story, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, not triumph, not even peace. Exactly, peace would come later, she suspected, in quieter moments than this one. What she felt walking toward that boardroom on a Thursday morning in early spring was the specific, uncomplicated clarity of a woman who knows exactly who she is. It had taken 15 years, a public humiliation, 61 days of the most demanding work of her life, and the legal provision her father had quietly buried in a trust document, like a letter left for her to find. But she had found it, and she had used it well. The Carter Foundation's first regional office opened on a Tuesday morning in October, 7 months after the board vote that had changed everything. Evelyn was there at 7:15 an hour before the staff arrived, sitting alone in the main conference room with a cup of coffee and the Foundation's first quarterly report, which she had been reviewing since 5 in the morning. The report covered the Foundation's initial operations, the legal clinics, the financial literacy workshops, the one-on-one counseling sessions for women navigating complex asset situations. The numbers were good, better than projected. The demand had been immediate and overwhelming in a way that told her something she had suspected but had not known with certainty until she saw the data. The need had always been there. It had simply been waiting for someone to build the door. Her phone lit up on the table beside her. Maya, her assistant, with a reminder about the 9 o'clock call with the Foundation's legal advisory board. Then a message from Daniel about a routine Carter Ridge Capital governance matter. Then a text from Caroline that said simply, "Proud of you." She read all 3 and set the phone back down. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments, about the night of the gala, about the elevator doors closing, about the decision that had felt in the moment she made it like an ending and had turned out to be the most significant beginning of her life. 7 months. It felt simultaneously like a very long time and like almost nothing at all. The Foundation staff began arriving at 8:15. 12 people, a mix of attorneys, financial counselors, and program coordinators, all of whom Evelyn had hired herself over the previous 4 months. She knew their backgrounds, their specific expertise, and what had drawn each of them to this work. She had interviewed every one of them personally, not because she didn't trust her hiring manager, but because she believed that the character of an organization lived in the people who showed up every day to do the work, and she intended to build something with character. At 8:45, 15 minutes before the advisory board call, her assistant knocked on the conference room door. "There's someone in the lobby asking to see you," Maya said. Her voice had a careful quality that immediately told Evelyn something was unusual. "He doesn't have an appointment. He said he knows you won't be expecting him. He asked me to give you this." She extended a small white card. Evelyn looked at it. On the front was a name she recognized, James Whitfield, managing partner of Whitfield Capital Group, one of the largest impact investment firms in the country. On the back in handwriting she did not recognize were 4 words: 5 minutes. Please, James. She looked at Maya. Send him in. James Whitfield was 64 years old, silver-haired, and carried himself with the slightly rumpled authority of a man who had spent decades in rooms where important decisions were made and had long since stopped needing to perform confidence. He shook Evelyn's hand and said immediately, without sitting down, "I'll be brief because I know you have a call in 12 minutes. I've been watching what you've built here for the past 4 months. I've spoken with 3 members of your advisory board without identifying myself because I wanted independent assessments. I've read your foundation's preliminary impact report, and I want to fund you." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "Sit down, James." He sat. "How much?" she said. $50 million over 5 years, he said. "Unrestricted. You deploy it however the Foundation's leadership determines is most effective. No board seats, no naming rights, no conditions." He paused. "The only thing I want in exchange is a quarterly briefing on impact metrics. Not because I need to approve your decisions, because I want to learn from what you're building." The room was quiet for a moment. Evelyn looked at the man across the table. She was good at reading people, she always had been, and what she read in James Whitfield was not the performative generosity of someone who wanted proximity to a compelling story. He was serious, he was direct, and he had done his homework in the specific, thorough way that told her he understood exactly what the Foundation was and what it could become. "Why no conditions?" she asked. $50 million with no conditions is unusual, James. Most funders want influence proportional to investment. "Because the work you're doing doesn't need my influence," he said simply. "It needs resources and freedom. I've made enough investments in my career to know the difference between an organization that needs direction and one that needs fuel. This is the second kind." He held her gaze. "And frankly, Evelyn, the world has enough organizations shaped by what wealthy men think women need. I'd rather fund one shaped by a woman who already knows." She was quiet for 5 seconds. Then she said, "I'll have Daniel Brooks contact your legal team today. We'll need full documentation of the gift structure and an agreement on the impact reporting format before we accept." Whitfield smiled for the first time. "Of course." He stood, shook her hand again, and left before the 9 o'clock call had even started. Maya appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. Did he just— $50 million, Evelyn said. "Get Daniel on the phone after the advisory call." Maya stared at her for 1 full second, then turned and walked rapidly back to her desk. The advisory board call lasted 40 minutes. Evelyn was sharp and focused, through all of it answering questions about program design, discussing the legal clinic expansion into 2 additional cities, reviewing the budget projections for year 2. She did not mention James Whitfield until the call was over, and then only to Daniel briefly with instructions about the documentation process. She had learned something important over the past 7 months. Large things were best handled quietly. Announcements came later when the work was done and the structure was solid. The announcement was never the thing. The thing was always the work. 3 weeks after James Whitfield's visit, Evelyn received a different kind of unexpected contact. It was a Thursday evening late, and she was still at the Foundation office reviewing case files from the legal clinic individual situations that her attorneys were working through women in various stages of financial crisis. Some in marriages like hers had been some in business partnerships, some dealing with family inheritance disputes. She read the case summaries regularly because she needed to understand at a granular level what the work actually looked like. It kept her grounded in the human reality of what the numbers in the impact report represented. Her personal cell phone rang at 8:47. The number was not in her contacts, but the area code was local. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then, some combination of habit and instinct made her answer. "Evelyn." The voice was immediately recognizable, and it stopped her completely. Older than she remembered. Quieter. Stripped of the practiced confidence she had spent 15 years listening to. "It's Richard." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "How did you get this number?" "Caroline," he said. "She didn't want to give it to me. I told her I needed 5 minutes. I told her I wasn't calling to cause problems." A pause. I'm not calling to cause problems. She stood up slowly from her desk. What do you want, Richard? The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she thought briefly he might hang up. I wanted to tell you something, he said, and I couldn't figure out how to do it through an attorney or in a letter, or I just needed to say it directly. Even if you hang up, even if you don't want to hear it. Another pause. I'm sorry. She waited. I'm sorry for the affair, he said. I'm sorry for how I treated you at the gala. I'm sorry for the way I grabbed your arm, for putting those diamonds on Vanessa in front of everyone like that, like you were nothing. His voice changed slightly on the last two words, became rougher. You were never nothing. You built everything. I know that now. I probably knew it then, and I couldn't stand it, and that's my failure, not yours. Evelyn stood very still. She had thought about this conversation before, had imagined various versions of it in the way you imagine things you believe might never actually happen. She had thought about what she would feel if Richard ever said these words, whether she would feel satisfaction, whether she would feel the specific relief of being finally formally acknowledged, whether she would feel anger at how long it had taken. She felt none of those things. What she felt was something quieter and more final, the specific stillness of someone standing at the end of something, looking back across its full length with clear eyes. I hear you, she said. Richard let out a breath. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know the things I did were... Richard, she said quietly, I forgive you. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. You do, he said. His voice had lost its careful structure entirely. He sounded for the first time in the conversation exactly as old and tired as he was. Yes, she said, not because what you did was acceptable, not because the harm was small, but because carrying the weight of it serves no purpose I'm interested in anymore. She paused. Forgiveness means I put it down. It doesn't mean I hand it back to you. I understand, he said. It was the kind of phrase people say in 100 different contexts, but the way he said it told her he meant it specifically, precisely, with the full weight of comprehension. Are you all right? She asked. It was a genuine question, not a performative one. I'm managing, he said. The friends mostly disappeared when the money situation became clear. Vanessa was gone inside a month. I have an apartment in Tribeca. I have some assets, the ones that were legitimately mine after the settlement. A pause. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Good, she said. I saw the announcement about the foundation, he said. I saw what you're doing for the women, the financial education, the legal support. His voice did something complicated on the next words. It should have always been like that. You should have always been out front. I was wrong to need you to be invisible. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She could have said many things. She had a lifetime's worth of things she could have said. Instead, she said, Take care of yourself, Richard. She ended the call. She stood in the quiet office for a long moment afterward. The building had emptied out around her, the foundation staff long since gone home, and the only sounds were the ventilation system and the distant, ever-present murmur of the city below. She thought about forgiveness, about what it actually was beneath all the ways people described it and misunderstood it, and either required it too quickly or withheld it too long. Forgiveness, she had come to understand, was not a gift you gave to the person who had hurt you. It was a decision you made about yourself, about what you were willing to carry and what you were willing to put down. She had put it down. She picked up her phone and called Caroline. He called me, Evelyn said when Caroline answered. I know, Caroline said immediately. I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have given him the number, but he sounded different, Evelyn. He sounded like he finally understood something. It's all right, Evelyn said. He did understand something, and I told him I forgave him. Caroline was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? Light, Evelyn said, and she meant it with complete simplicity. I feel light. 5 months later, Evelyn stood on the stage of the National Leadership and Innovation Summit in New York, in front of an audience of 3,000 people, and delivered a keynote address that had taken her 6 weeks to write and that she had revised 17 times. She had not wanted to give the speech, or rather, she had not wanted to give the kind of speech people expected the triumphant narrative of a woman who had fought back and won the clean, inspiring arc of defeat transformed into victory. That story was too simple. It flattened the 15 years into a lesson, made the pain into a device, reduced everything complicated and human and genuinely costly about what had happened into something that could fit on a motivational poster. She had almost declined the invitation entirely. Then she had read 3 more case files from the Foundation's legal clinic in one evening. 3 women in 3 different states, 3 different circumstances, all of them operating with the same fundamental disadvantage. They did not know what they legally owned, what they were legally owed, and what rights they had to protect both. And she had understood that the speech was not about her story. Her story was the vehicle. The destination was something else entirely. So she had written a different speech than the one they were expecting. She stood at the podium and said, "I am not here to tell you how I won. I am here to tell you why so many women are still losing and what we can do about it today." The room shifted. She felt it, the collective adjustment of 3,000 people recalibrating their expectations. She spoke for 38 minutes. She talked about financial literacy not as a personal virtue, but as a structural right. She talked about the specific ways that legal and financial systems had historically been designed without women as primary actors, and how that design created ongoing vulnerabilities that had nothing to do with intelligence or capability and everything to do with access to information. She talked about what the Carter Foundation had found in its first year of operation, the patterns across hundreds of cases, the common points of financial vulnerability, the specific moments where better information would have changed outcomes. She did not make herself the hero of the story. She made the women in the case files the center of it. When she finished, the audience was quiet for about 2 full seconds, the specific silence of a crowd that is processing something rather than simply reacting to it. Then the applause began, and it was the kind that builds, rather than peaks, immediately the kind that means something has actually landed. She walked off the stage to where Maya was waiting with her phone and her portfolio. 47 media requests in the last 20 minutes, Maya said, and James Whitfield is in the lobby. He says he wants to introduce you to someone. She looked at Maya. Who? He didn't say. He just said you'd want to meet her. Evelyn straightened her jacket and walked toward the lobby. James Whitfield was standing with a woman who appeared to be in her late 40s, well-dressed, but with the slightly worn quality of someone who had been navigating something difficult for a long time. The woman had the specific posture of someone who is accustomed to holding herself together by main force of will. James said, "Evelyn, this is Dr. Sarah Brennan. She's a researcher at Columbia. She's been studying financial abuse and asset manipulation in marriages for 11 years. She has a data set of 4,000 cases, and she's been trying to find a way to turn it into policy recommendations for 3 years." He paused. "She needs a partner who understands both the financial and the legal landscape from the inside." Evelyn looked at Sarah Brennan. Sarah Brennan looked back at her with the careful assessing eyes of someone who has been disappointed before by people who seemed promising and is trying to determine if this time is different. Evelyn extended her hand. "Tell me about the data set," she said. Sarah Brennan's shoulders came down about half an inch. She shook Evelyn's hand and began talking. They stood in that lobby for 45 minutes. They missed 3 of Maya's gentle attempts to redirect Evelyn to the media requests. They sat down on a bench near the window when it became clear the conversation needed more than a standing position could accommodate. By the end of 45 minutes, they had the outline of a research partnership that would eventually produce the most comprehensive policy brief on financial abuse and asset protection ever submitted to a federal legislative committee. But Evelyn did not know that yet. She just knew she was in the right conversation. She called Daniel that evening on her way back to the foundation office, where she planned to work for another 2 hours before going home. "Good speech," he said when he answered. He had watched the live stream. "It was the right speech," she said, "which is different from a good speech." He was quiet for a moment. "How are you, Evelyn, honestly? It's been a year." She thought about the question with the same attention she brought to everything. A year since the gala, a year since the elevator, a year since the conference table covered in folders at 4 a.m, and Daniel across from her with his 3rd cup of coffee, and the moment she had looked at the papers in front of her and understood exactly what she was going to do and exactly what it was going to cost. "I'm well," she said. And then, because Daniel deserved more than 2 words after everything, "I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Every day I'm doing exactly the right thing with exactly the right resources in exactly the right direction." She paused. "That's not something a lot of people get to say. I don't take it lightly." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You never have." She ended the call as the car pulled up to the foundation building. She went upstairs, she sat at her desk, she opened the case files. There was a woman in Ohio whose husband had structured their business assets so that she had no legal access to the company she had co-founded for 11 years. There was a woman in Texas who had discovered upon filing for divorce that her name had been removed from the deed to the house she had lived in for 2 decades. There was a woman in Georgia who had built a consulting practice and given her husband power of attorney during a medical crisis and come out of the crisis to find the accounts restructured in ways that cut her out entirely. 3 women, 3 different states, 3 versions of the same fundamental story, a woman who had built something and been told through the architecture of financial and legal systems used as weapons that it did not belong to her. Evelyn read each file carefully, the way she read everything, with full attention, with the specific quality of someone who understands that every number in a document is a person's actual life. Then she opened a new page in her legal pad and began writing notes for the Foundation's next program design meeting. She worked until 10:15. She went home. She slept well. In the morning, she woke at 5, made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, the same table where 12 years ago she had finished an acquisition model that Richard had presented to investors as his own, and she looked out at the city beginning to lighten, from black to gray, to the specific gold of early morning. She thought about her father, about the provision he had buried in the trust document like a gift left wrapped and waiting. About the 20 years of trust he had built with her before he died, the trust that had made it possible for her to find that provision when she needed it, to understand it, to use it correctly. She thought about Daniel, who had picked up the phone at 11 at night a year ago and had not once in the 12 months since given her anything less than his complete and careful best. She thought about Maya and Patricia Huang and Carol Vance and Charles Elliott and Margaret Whitmore and Sarah Brennan standing in a lobby talking about 4,000 case files with the barely contained urgency of someone who has been carrying important information alone for too long. She thought about the 2,314 employees who still had their jobs. She thought about Richard in an apartment in Tribeca managing. She thought about the woman in Ohio and the woman in Texas and the woman in Georgia. She picked up her coffee cup. She sat with all of it for a moment, all the loss and all the work and all the people and all the documents and all the quiet, patient, unglamorous effort of building something real, and she felt it settle into its proper shape. Not a story of triumph over a villain, not a cautionary tale, not an inspiration arc with a clean ending. Something truer than all of those. A woman who had known her own value, protected it with everything she had refused to let someone else's betrayal become the defining fact of her life, and built something from the ground up that would outlast every damage that had been done to her. She set the coffee cup down. She picked up her phone and opened the Foundation's case management system and began reviewing the morning's new intake files. The sun came up over Manhattan. She was already working. That was who Evelyn Carter had always been, not the woman standing at the window of someone else's empire, but the architect of her own. And now at last, everyone knew it.